Benjamin Franklin, also called Ben Franklin, pseudonym Richard Saunders, born January 17th, January 6th, Old Style, 1706, Boston, Massachusetts, U.S. Died April 17, 1790, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, U.S., American printer and publisher, author, inventor and scientist, and diplomat. One of the foremost of the Founding Fathers, Franklin helped draft the Declaration of Independence and was one of its signers, represented the United States in France during the American Revolution, and was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He made important contributions to science, especially in the understanding of electricity, and is remembered for the wit, wisdom, and elegance of his writing. Franklin was born the 10th son of the 17 children of a man who made soap and candles, one of the lowliest of the artisan crafts. In an age that privileged the firstborn son, Franklin was, as he tartly noted in his autobiography, the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations back. He learned to read very early and had 1 year in grammar school and another under a private teacher, but his formal education ended at age 10. At 12 he was apprenticed to his brother James, a printer. His mastery of the printer's trade, of which he was proud to the end of his life, was achieved between 1718 and 1723. In the same period he read tirelessly and taught himself to write effectively. His first enthusiasm was for poetry, but, discouraged with the quality of his own, he gave it up. Prose was another matter. Young Franklin discovered a volume of The Spectator, featuring Joseph Addison and Sir Richard Steele's famous periodical essays, which had appeared in England in 1711-12, and saw in it a means for improving his writing. He read these Spectator papers over and over, copied and recopied them, and then tried to recall them from memory. He even turned them into poetry and then back into prose. Franklin realized, as all the founders did, that writing competently was such a rare talent in the 18th century that anyone who could do it well immediately attracted attention. Prose writing became, as he recalled in his autobiography, of great use to me in the course of my life, and was a principal means of my advancement. In 1721 James Franklin founded a weekly newspaper, the New England Courant, to which readers were invited to contribute. Benjamin, now 16, read and perhaps set and type these contributions and decided that he could do as well himself. In 1722 he wrote a series of 14 essays signed Silence Do Good, in which he lampooned everything from funeral eulogies to the students of Harvard College. For one so young to assume the persona of a middle-aged woman was a remarkable feat, and Franklin took exquisite pleasure in the fact that his brother and others became convinced that only a learned and ingenious wit could have written these essays. Late in 1722 James Franklin got into trouble with the provincial authorities and was forbidden to print or publish the Courant. To keep the paper going, he discharged his younger brother from his original apprenticeship and made him the paper's nominal publisher. New indentures were drawn up but not made public. Some months later, after a bitter quarrel, Benjamin secretly left home, sure that James would not go to law and reveal the subterfuge he had devised. Failing to find work in New York City, Franklin at age 17 went on to Quaker-dominated Philadelphia, a much more open and religiously tolerant place than Puritan Boston. One of the most memorable scenes of the autobiography is the description of his arrival on a Sunday morning, tired and hungry. Finding a bakery, he asked for 3 pennies worth of bread and got 3 great puffy rolls. Carrying one under each arm and munching on the third, he walked up Market Street past the door of the Reed family, where stood Deborah, his future wife. She saw him and thought I made, as I certainly did, a most awkward, ridiculous appearance. A few weeks later he was rooming at the Reeds and employed as a printer. By the spring of 1724 he was enjoying the companionship of other young men with a taste for reading, and he was also being urged to set up in business for himself by the governor of Pennsylvania, Sir William Keith. At Keith's suggestion, Franklin returned to Boston to try to raise the necessary capital. His father thought him too young for such a venture, so Keith offered to foot the bill himself and arranged Franklin's passage to England so that he could choose his type and make connections with London stationers and booksellers. Franklin exchanged some promises about marriage with Deborah Reed and, with a young friend, James Ralph, as his companion, sailed for London in November 1724, just over a year after arriving in Philadelphia. Not until his ship was well out at sea did he realize that Governor Keith had not delivered the letters of credit and introduction he had promised. In London, Franklin quickly found employment in his trade and was able to lend money to Ralph, who was trying to establish himself as a writer. The two young men enjoyed the theater and the other pleasures of the city, including women. While in London, Franklin wrote a dissertation on liberty and necessity, pleasure and pain, 1725, a deistical pamphlet inspired by his having set type for William Wollaston's moral tract, The Religion of Nature Delineated. Franklin argued in his essay that since human beings have no real freedom of choice, they are not morally responsible for their actions. This was perhaps a nice justification for his self-indulgent behavior in London and his ignoring of Deborah, to whom he had written only once. He later repudiated the pamphlet, burning all but one of the copies still in his possession. By 1726, Franklin was tiring of London. He considered becoming an itinerant teacher of swimming, but when Thomas Denham, a Quaker merchant, offered him a clerkship in his store in Philadelphia with a prospect of fat commissions in the West Indian trade, he decided to return home. Before he left for London, Franklin decided to bring his Poor Richard's Almanac to an end. While at sea in 1757, he completed a 12-page preface for the final 1758 edition of the almanac titled Father Abraham's Speech and later known as The Way to Wealth. In this preface, Father Abraham cites only those proverbs that concern hard work, thrift, and financial prudence. The Way to Wealth eventually became the most widely reprinted of all Franklin's works, including the autobiography. This time Franklin's experience in London was very different from his sojourn in 1724-26. London was the largest city in Europe and the center of the burgeoning British Empire, and Franklin was famous. Consequently, he met everyone else who was famous, including David Hume, Captain James Cook, Joseph Priestley, and John Pringle, who was physician to Lord Bute, the King's chief minister. In 1759, Franklin received an honorary degree from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, which led to his thereafter being called Dr. Franklin. Another honorary degree followed in 1762 from the University of Oxford. Everyone wanted to paint his portrait and make mezzotints for sale to the public. Franklin fell in love with the sophistication of London and England. By contrast, he disparaged the provinciality and vulgarity of America. He was very much the royalist, and he bragged of his connection with Lord Bute, which enabled him in 1762 to get his son, William, then age 31, appointed royal governor of New Jersey. In 1757 he went to England as the agent of the Pennsylvania Assembly in order to get the family of William Penn, the proprietors under the colony's charter, to allow the colonial legislature to tax their ungranted lands. But Franklin and some of his allies in the Assembly had a larger goal of persuading the British government to oust the Penn family as the proprietors of Pennsylvania and make that colony a royal province. Except for a 2-year return to Philadelphia in 1762-64, Franklin spent the next 18 years living in London, most of the time in the apartment of Margaret Stevenson, a widow, and her daughter Polly at 36 Craven Street near Charing Cross. His son, William, now age 27, accompanied him to London along with 2 enslaved persons. Deborah and their daughter, Sally, age 14, remained in Philadelphia.